What remains less precisely mapped is the quantitative transfer function. At what exact voltage magnitude and frequency the cellular response is maximally activated. The mechanisms are established. The engineering parameters are still being resolved. Think about what this means for the physical reality of your ordinary life. Every step you take on a hard surface produces a mechanical impulse that travels up your skeleton, deforms the collagen matrix at the nanometer scale, generates a piezoelectric potential across bone surfaces, drives interstitial fluid through canalicular channels, activates piezo channels on osteocyte processes, floods those cells with calcium, propagates a signaling wave through the lacunocanalicular network, suppresses sclerostin secretion, releases the WNT pathway from inhibition, and instructs osteoblasts to deposit new mineral matrix. The architecture of your skeleton at this moment, the cortical thickness of your femur, the trabecular density in your lumbar vertebrae, the cross-sectional geometry of your tibia, is a direct physical record of every load you have habitually applied to your body over your lifetime. Your bones are not passive scaffolding. They are a continuously updated structural record written in the language of electricity. And the system runs in reverse when the inputs disappear. 8 hours in a chair transfers your body weight through soft tissue to the seat surface, largely bypassing the long bones. The osteocytes in your femur and tibia receive almost no strain signal during those hours. Sclerostin accumulates. In a single week of complete bed rest, measurable changes in bone turnover markers are detectable in blood and urine. The bones of habitual shoe wearers, studied through skeletal remains from archaeological populations before and after the adoption of footwear, show structural differences in trabecular architecture of the calcaneus and metatarsals that appear to reflect differences in loading pattern and magnitude. More uniform loading, lower peak stresses, fewer varied mechanical inputs from varied terrain. The insole attenuates and homogenizes ground reaction forces. The electrical conversation in the foot bones is muffled. None of this requires adopting any particular lifestyle. What it requires is the correct model of what bone actually is, not static scaffolding, but a dynamic, electrically active, continuously responsive structure. Walk on varied terrain. Carry things, jump occasionally. Let your feet contact ground that is not perfectly flat. The mechanostat theory implies that it is variation in loading, not just volume, that produces the richest osteocyte signaling environment. Novel mechanical inputs from new directions produce strain patterns that depart from the baseline. And it is those departures, those unexpected electrical events, that drive the most active bone formation responses. When you stood up at the beginning of this, the moment your weight shifted from the seat to your feet, your calcaneus underwent a piezoelectric strain. Your canalicular fluid moved. Your osteocytes fired calcium transients that propagated outward through gap junctions to their neighbors. Sclerostin levels in your foot bones ticked downward. The WNT pathway opened a degree, and somewhere in the mineral matrix of your long bones, the construction program that will determine whether you are standing or falling 30 years from now adjusted its parameters accordingly. One step. That is the unit of input. The system has been counting every one of them since the first time you learned to stand. Stand up for a moment. Don't walk anywhere. Just stand. Feel your weight pressing down through your legs, through your ankles, through the arches of your feet. You are doing something right now that most people never think twice about. And inside the bones of your feet, your shins, your femurs, and your spine, something electrical is happening. Not metaphorically electrical. Not sending signals the way a doctor waves a hand to mean nerves are firing. Literally electrical. Your bones are generating voltage every time they bear your weight. And that voltage is doing something so specific and so consequential that researchers spent decades arguing about whether it was real, and then another 2 decades arguing about what it meant. This is not a small footnote in orthopedic textbooks. It is one of the central mechanisms by which your skeleton rebuilds itself, adapts to demand, and keeps you structurally intact across a lifetime of mechanical insult. The electrical component of bone was first proposed seriously in the 1950s, and the researchers who measured it were largely dismissed. They were not dismissed because their measurements were wrong. They were dismissed because nobody had a framework for what living tissue generating electricity could possibly mean. The first person to make the argument with hard numbers was a Japanese orthopedic surgeon named Eiichi Fukada, working at the Institute of Physical and Chemical Research in Tokyo. In 1953, Fukada placed dried bone under a mechanical press and measured something that had no business being there: a piezoelectric potential. Piezoelectricity, from the Greek piezein, to squeeze, is the property of certain crystals to generate an electric charge when mechanically deformed. Quartz does it. Certain ceramics do it. Your cigarette lighter almost certainly uses a piezoelectric crystal to generate the spark that ignites the gas. Bone, Fukada found, also does it. When he compressed a segment of cortical bone, it generated a measurable voltage across its surface. When he released the pressure, the voltage reversed polarity. The bone was not just hard tissue, it was a transducer, a device that converts mechanical force into electrical signal. The response from the Western scientific community was polite skepticism. Bone was not a crystal, and the piezoelectric effect was understood as a property of highly ordered inorganic lattices, materials like quartz and Rochelle salt, with perfectly repeating atomic arrangements and no center of symmetry. What could the wet, irregular, biologically complex tissue of bone possibly have in common with industrial crystal? The answer turned out to be collagen, and specifically, the way collagen is organized in bone at a scale measured in nanometers. Bone is not a single material. It is a composite. Roughly 65% by dry weight is mineral. Hydroxyapatite, a calcium phosphate crystal with the formula Ca10PO4 6OH22, and approximately 30% is an organic protein matrix, primarily type 1 collagen fibers. Those collagen fibers are not randomly arranged. Each collagen molecule is a triple helix of polypeptide chains, and those helices are assembled into fibrils with a precise quarter stagger arrangement. The stagger creates a repeating periodic structure with a characteristic D-spacing of 67 nanometers, a number that appears in X-ray diffraction patterns of bone from any vertebrate species you care to name. It is this regular, repeating molecular architecture that gives bone its piezoelectric behavior. When the collagen matrix is mechanically strained, the asymmetric charge distribution within the triple helix produces a net electrical dipole, and that dipole, summed across billions of aligned fibers all deforming in the same direction under load, becomes a detectable voltage. Fukada was not measuring an artifact. He was measuring the electrical consequence of molecular geometry. The voltage is small by engineering standards. A moderate mechanical load on a long bone produces a potential on the order of tenths of a millivolt per unit strain, typically in the range of 0.1 to 1 millivolt under physiological loading conditions. But small does not mean insignificant. The cell membrane potential of a resting osteocyte is approximately -70 millivolts, the same order of magnitude as neurons. A change of even a few millivolts at the cell membrane is enough to open voltage-sensitive ion channels and trigger a cascade of intracellular events. What matters is not the absolute magnitude of the piezoelectric signal, but what the cells embedded in that matrix are tuned to detect. There is a second mechanism operating through your bones at the same time, and it produces electrical signals by an entirely different physical process. When you load bone mechanically, when you run, land a jump, carry a load up a flight of stairs, the bone matrix very slightly deforms. Not enough to crack, not enough to feel, but enough to compress the fluid-filled spaces inside the tissue. Bone is not solid all the way through. Threaded through the mineral matrix at a scale visible only under a high-resolution microscope is a lacuno-canalicular system, a network of microscopic chambers and channels. Each chamber, called a lacuna, houses a single osteocyte, the most abundant cell type in mature bone. Each lacuna is connected to dozens of neighboring lacunae by slender tubular passages called canaliculi, roughly 0.1 to 0.3 micrometers in diameter. These passages are filled with interstitial fluid and contain the cytoplasmic projections of the osteocyte itself. When bone is mechanically loaded, the deformation of the matrix drives fluid through the canalicular network, creating a pressure gradient and a fluid flow. That flowing fluid carries ions, calcium, potassium, sodium, and moving ions in a confined biological tube generate what physicists call streaming potentials. A second electrical signal, distinct in origin from the piezoelectric effect, but operating simultaneously and in a direction and magnitude that reinforces the piezoelectric signal rather than opposing it. The streaming potential mechanism was characterized experimentally by Steven Cowin and colleagues at the City University of New York in a series of papers from the 1990s. Cowin's group solved the coupled poroelastic equations governing fluid flow through the lacuno-canalicular geometry and showed that at canalicular flow velocities produced by ordinary locomotion, streaming potentials would reach magnitudes of 1 to 10 millivolts at the osteocyte cell membrane. Enough to be physiologically meaningful, enough to activate mechanosensitive ion channels. This was the quantitative bridge between the macro-scale mechanics of walking and the micro-scale electrical events inside individual bone cells. The osteocyte sitting in its lacuna is exquisitely sensitive to that fluid flow. The cell extends long cytoplasmic processes into the canaliculi. A single osteocyte may project 50 to 60 such processes through the surrounding matrix, and those processes are studded with mechanosensitive ion channels, specifically members of the piezo family. PIEZO1 and PIEZO2 are large transmembrane proteins that form a mechanically gated ion channel. When the membrane is deformed by fluid shear stress or stretch, the channel opens within milliseconds. Calcium floods in from the canalicular fluid. The intracellular calcium transient is the first step in a signaling cascade that travels from cell to cell through connexin 43 gap junctions linking neighboring osteocytes. A single mechanical event anywhere in the bone matrix propagates as a calcium wave through the osteocyte network, a living sensory web embedded in rock-hard tissue, reporting the spatial distribution of load across the entire structure in real time. Ardem Patapoutian at Scripps Research Institute and Howard Hughes Medical Institute spent years isolating and characterizing the piezo channels. Work that required developing a custom high-throughput screening method to identify which of thousands of candidate genes produced the characteristic mechanosensitive current. The elegance of piezo is that it is both the sensor and the relay. The same channel that opens in response to mechanical deformation generates the calcium transient that initiates the biological response. There is no intervening step, no second messenger required. Force becomes signal in one molecular event. Patapoutian shared the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2021 for this work, alongside David Julius. And while most of the public commentary focused on pain research and touch sensation, the implications for bone biology were immediate and profound. What does the osteocyte network do with the information it collects? This is where the story changes completely, because the network does not merely sense loading. It controls the construction and demolition crews that maintain bone architecture. The key regulatory molecule is a protein called sclerostin, encoded by the SOST gene and secreted by osteocytes under low-load conditions. Sclerostin is an antagonist of the WNT signaling pathway. It binds to LRP5 and LRP6 coreceptors on the surface of osteoblast precursors and blocks the WNT ligand from activating them. With WNT signaling inhibited, osteoblast differentiation is suppressed, bone formation slows, and the structural maintenance program idles. When mechanical strain rises above what Harold Frost at the Southern Colorado Clinic and Research Institute defined as the minimum effective strain threshold, in the range of 1,000 to 3,000 microstrain for human bone under physiological conditions, the osteocyte network responds by drastically reducing sclerostin secretion. The WNT pathway is released from inhibition. Osteoblast precursors differentiate. New bone matrix is deposited in the exact locations where the strain signal was highest. Frost articulated the broader theory, which he called the mechanostat, formally in 1987 in the journal Calcified Tissue International. The mechanostat proposes that bone mass is regulated by a homeostatic feedback system in which the set point is a target strain range. Load the bone above the set point, and the system responds by adding bone until the strain per unit load is reduced back to the target. Load the bone below the set point, or remove the load entirely, and the system runs in reverse. Sclerostin rises. The rank-rankle pathway, which drives osteoclast activation and bone resorption, is no longer suppressed by osteocyte signaling. Osteoclasts, the bone-destroying cells, begin excavating mineralized matrix faster than osteoblasts can replace it. The bone thins. This is why astronauts in the microgravity environment of the International Space Station lose bone density at a rate measured between 1 and 2% per month in the spine and proximal femur. Not because their diet lacks calcium, not because their parathyroid hormone is dysregulated, because the gravitational load that would normally generate piezoelectric and streaming potential signals in their weight-bearing bones is absent. The osteocyte network, receiving no strain signal, reports that no construction is needed. The sclerostin level rises, the bones thin. John Sibonga and colleagues at the NASA Johnson Space Center have tracked bone density in ISS crew members using quantitative computed tomography before and after missions of 6 months or more, and have documented losses of 3 to 8% in total hip bone mineral density, losses that recover only partially in the 12 months following return to Earth. After 6 months aboard the station, the average crew member returns with skeletal density comparable to a person a decade older. Extraordinary remediation efforts with resistive exercise devices on the station can slow this, but have not yet prevented it. Julius Wolff articulated the principle of bone functional adaptation in 1892, without knowing anything about piezoelectricity, collagen crystallography, streaming potentials, or piezo channels. Wolff, a Berlin surgeon, studied the internal architecture of cancellous bone, the spongy lattice of mineralized trabecular struts inside the heads of femurs, the bodies of vertebrae, and the ends of long bones. He observed, in detailed histological sections, that the spatial arrangement of these trabeculae precisely aligned with the principal stress trajectories calculated by structural engineers for loaded beams under the same geometry. The head of the femur, subjected to compressive and tensile forces by body weight transmitted through the hip joint, showed trabecular architecture that matched the stress lines a mechanical engineer would draw for a structure carrying those loads. Wolff concluded that bone actively remodels its internal architecture in response to the stresses it habitually bears. He called this observation the law of bone transformation, but Wolff had no mechanism. He had the consequence without the cause, pattern matching between engineering calculations and histological sections, with nothing to explain how a cell inside mineralized matrix could possibly know which direction to grow. The mechanism would take another century to begin to be filled in. And here is the part of this story that I find genuinely striking. The electrical signals in bone are not merely a biological curiosity. They are clinically manipulable. In the 1970s, 2 researchers at Columbia University, Andrew Bassett and Robert Becker, began experimenting with pulsed electromagnetic fields applied to non-healing fractures. A non-union fracture is a fracture that has failed to knit together through the normal biological healing process. Approximately 5 to 10% of all fractures become non-unions. The site remains mobile, vascularization fails to re-establish properly, and the gap between bone ends fills with fibrous tissue rather than new bone. In 1977, surgical stabilization and bone grafting were the primary treatment options, with success rates that left significant room for improvement. Bassett and Becker hypothesized that the failure of non-union fractures might in part represent a failure of the electrical environment at the fracture site. A region of disrupted vasculature means a region of disrupted interstitial fluid flow, which means a region producing diminished streaming potentials even in a patient who is mobile and loading the limb. The osteocytes adjacent to the fracture gap receive reduced electrical input. The WNT pathway does not activate. The construction program does not engage. The first controlled clinical trial results, published through the late 1970s and early 1980s, showed union rates of 70 to 80% in fractures that had failed to heal for an average of 4 years. These were people who had been carrying a broken bone for 4 years that their own biology had been unable to repair. The Food and Drug Administration cleared bone growth stimulators for clinical use in 1979, making pulsed electromagnetic field devices the first FDA-approved electrical therapy for any musculoskeletal condition. By the early 2000s, more than 1 million such devices had been applied to non-healing fractures worldwide. The device is typically worn strapped around the limb for several hours per day for several months. A non-invasive, painless electromagnetic field generator that speaks the same language as mechanically loaded bone and tells the tissue it is time to rebuild. The mechanism by which externally applied pulsed electromagnetic fields work at the cellular level remains under investigation. The external field may induce eddy currents within the bone tissue that mimic streaming potentials at the canalicular scale, impersonating the signal that mechanically driven fluid flow would normally produce. Alternatively, the oscillating field gradient may directly activate piezo channels on osteocyte processes through membrane tension effects. What is not debated is the clinical outcome. The electrical language of bone is coherent enough that an external device, with no physical contact with the skeleton, can speak it fluently enough to restart biological construction in tissue dormant for years. There is another dimension of this system that becomes medically critical as you age, because the mechanostat does not stay fixed across a lifetime. The strain threshold at which osteocytes suppress sclerostin and authorize bone formation appears to shift with sex hormone levels. Both estrogen and testosterone sensitize osteocytes to mechanical signals. Estrogen by upregulating estrogen receptor alpha expression in osteocytes, which modulates downstream piezo channel sensitivity, and testosterone by amplifying WNT signaling in osteoblasts. This is why the sharp decline in estrogen at menopause produces such rapid bone loss. Not only because estrogen directly protects bone cells, but because its withdrawal raises the effective strain threshold. The osteocyte network becomes less sensitive. The same load that previously suppressed sclerostin now falls below the adjusted threshold. The construction program idles while the skeleton continues to be used. Marcus Saito and colleagues at the University of Tokyo measured sclerostin levels in postmenopausal women and found them significantly elevated compared to premenopausal controls at equivalent physical activity levels, consistent with a mechanosensitivity shift rather than simply reduced loading. The practical implication of this finding is specific. Low-impact activity like walking, swimming, or cycling is valuable for cardiovascular fitness, but produces modest piezoelectric signal in bone. Swimming in particular provides almost no gravitational loading of the appendicular skeleton. What produces the most potent osteocyte activation is impact loading, the transient ground reaction force spike that occurs when the foot strikes a surface and sends a mechanical impulse up through the skeleton at high strain rate. Belinda Beck and colleagues at Griffith University found that brief programs of high-impact jumping, as few as 10 sets of 10 jumps per day, roughly 4 minutes of total activity, produced measurable increases in proximal femur bone density over 16 weeks in premenopausal women. The key variable was not duration or total exercise volume. It was peak strain rate, how rapidly the electrical signal was generated. The osteocyte calcium transient is most strongly activated by fast, high-magnitude loading events, not by slow, sustained ones. 4 minutes of jumping outperforms 30 minutes of cycling for bone signal generation. The biology is calibrated for the kind of varied, impact-laden physical life our ancestors lived before chairs, soft shoes, and flat pavement removed most of the mechanical variation from the equation. Now the evidence calibration, because the mechanisms described here sit at different levels of certainty. The piezoelectric effect in collagen and bone is established physics, replicated in hundreds of independent studies since Fukada's original 1953 measurement. The streaming potential mechanism is well characterized by Cowin's theoretical and experimental work. The role of piezo channels in osteocyte mechanosensation received the highest scientific endorsement with the 2021 Nobel Prize. The link between osteocyte electrical signaling and sclerostin suppression is supported by knockout mouse data and human genetic evidence. People with loss-of-function mutations in the SOST gene develop sclerostiosis, a condition of dramatically increased bone density, exactly as the mechanostat model predicts. The clinical evidence for electromagnetic bone stimulation is solid at the outcomes level.